I've developed a pretty traditional, if not very boring, layout here to use as a starting point for looking at floating elements.
This video is brought to you by OppiePie's Academy.
So we've got the typical linear one div laid out after another layout here in the browser. Let's take a quick look at the code. So I have a container div that envelops everything inside our document. I recommend you do this if you're going to be using floats to lay out your document. Just makes things easier. We then have a header section, and I've got a div ID as header, and in there we've got an H1 and an H2 tag, and this will serve as kind of the head of the document right here. So that's our header. And we could see it visually if I open up the developers tools inside my Chrome browser by clicking right here and choosing more tools and developer tools. And we can get a kind of a physical layout of the divs. So there is the container, and I open that up. There's our header right there. So you can see exactly where the bounds of the header div is. I haven't done anything to it as far as layout, just left it alone. Then we have our secondary news story, and that div includes these three paragraphs. And notice at the end of the div, this is called a comment. This is ignored by the browser. This is here to remind me which div tag this is closing. So here we have the closing div tag. Then we have our primary news story with another H2 and a bunch of text after that. That closes here and is followed by a footer. And all the footer has is a copyright notice that you can see right there, or in the browser, copyright notice down here at the bottom. The copyright notice and the text in the header is centered because of a little bit of CSS that I have right here. Just took the footer and the header and I aligned the text to the center within those particular elements. So that's our layout, but let's say we wanted a more interesting layout and we wanted the two news stories to be next to each other. So that's typically where we'd use floats. So let's first off set up a entry here in the CSS for all of our containers. So we have the header, we have secondary, we then have our primary news story and our footer. So let's get those IDs as well. So this next one will be primary. And then footer. And if we want to make adjustments to the container, we can do that too. So I can put any container rules right here. So for the container rules, the rules would apply for the entire container. So let's say, for example, I wanted the primary font to be Arial. I could put that here in the container with font family Arial, and probably should make a secondary selection of sans serif in case Arial's not available. Save, and now notice everything is Arial. All right, so now let's get to the layout. So first off, our header is going to have a width of 100%. That's going to go all the way across the document. Now let's say our secondary, let's say it's got a width of 30%, because we want that to be 30%, like a small column on the left. And then our primary has a width of 70%. I like setting the widths first. And then the footer has a width of 100% again. Now this is going to look kind of funky when we look at it right now, because there's our 30%, there's our 70%, and there's our 100% again. So that doesn't look quite right. But now we'll set the floats. So let's set our secondary to float left, and let's set our primary to float right. Open this up just a little bit more. And now we have the two stories floating next to each other. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to take the secondary story and just set the font size down slightly to maybe 0.9 em, just to get to try and, there we go, make it flow a little bit better. All right, so now we've got these floating next to each other, but look what's happening to our copy rate, which is supposed to be 100%, but it's kind of getting sucked up here into this left-hand column. And that's because it's still trying to float. You remember from the previous lesson that once you kind of break that natural one on top of the other layout that the browser wants to do, then all rules are off. And once that layout's broken, then things that don't have a specific layout scheme or elements that don't have a specific layout scheme can end up in weird places. So for the footer, we're going to clear both the right and left float, just with clear both like that. And now watch what happens. We've saved the document. And now there's our footer there at the bottom. So this works pretty well. Now, the one thing that you've got to be kind of careful of is setting widths that add up to larger than 100% of the document. So let's say, for example, here I set the secondary to 31%. So now we have 31% plus 70%. Watch what happens. So our whole float scheme is screwed up and looks weird because we're trying to occupy more than 100% of the document. Now, where that commonly takes place is if you have set widths and margins and things like that. But let's set some padding here just to make things look a little less crowded. So set 3 pixels of padding. And notice we're still in this situation here because the padding is added on top of the width. So you might want to accommodate that by having widths that are slightly less than 100. That should just about do it. And everything looks the way it's supposed to again. And we can kind of stretch out. And this works till we get pretty small. Once you get pretty small, notice the floats don't work as well. And that's something we'll learn to solve here in a few minutes in the next lesson. But that's typical of, like, for example, mobile devices. But for desktop web browsing, this looks pretty good. So we've got our 2 floating elements, the secondary floating to the left, the primary floating to the right, and this way we've got kind of this column structure that we've now done with our HTML and CSS.